So anytime we say psoas, we're actually referring to one of them is on the right and one on the left. And it runs through the core of the pelvis and the lower back, kind of through the core of the body, right in front of the spine. So it's long and very deep. And its job is to flex the hip. But because of its relationship to all the other muscles in this area, and because it runs all the way up the front of the spine, all the way up to the last of the thoracic vertebrae, it also will do double duty as a stabilizer of the spine, particularly if the other muscles that are supposed to be stabilizing the pelvis and the spine or the legs are weak or injured or not doing their job. They're offline. So we'll take a look at the other musculature in just a second so we can begin to understand how important this muscle is because you can see how related it is to everything else that's going on in the pelvis. But it also, in addition to flexing the leg, so what that means, of course, when you're flexing the hip joint is this is the muscle for walking and running and jumping and playing tennis. And it's flexed when you're sitting, and it's flexed when you're going upstairs. And it's also the torso flexor. So if you sit with your legs in a fixed position and contract the psoas, the torso bends. And that would be the case in asana practices like seated forward bends, where the legs are stable and the torso is bent forward. So any flexing at the hip, if the pelvis and torso are upright, which is the usual case, then the contraction of the psoas lifts the thigh, and that's the flexion of the hip joint. So that's its major job, which is huge. But then, as I mentioned, also stability and integration. This kind of an integrating capacity between the pelvis and the chest. So this becomes important energetically, physiologically, as well as biomechanically. So taking a little bit closer look at the structure, you can see that it actually, the origin of it is, part of it is all the way up the spine at the very last thoracic vertebrae. It's called the T12. The diaphragm also is connected to this vertebrae, along with a number of other very important stabilizing muscles, including some that are on the back side, like the trapezius. And then it's connected all the way down the lumbar spine. There are 5 lumbar spines. So the psoas is attached to all of those, part of it to the transverse processes on those vertebrae and part of it to the body of the vertebrae. And moves down into the pelvis, where it's joined by another muscle called the iliacus, and both sides, of course. And the iliacus comes from the inside edge of the hip, the big hip crest, and joins the psoas. So sometimes you'll see this muscle referred to as the iliopsoas. And then it moves down across the hip joint and attaches on what's called the lesser trochanter, the big knob on the femur. And then, so that when it shortens, it lifts the thigh. So because it's moving through all of these crucial areas of the pelvis and the lumbar spine, you can see how important it is and how likely it is to be sensitive to any kind of mechanical irregularities or muscular problems in all the other muscles in this area. In particular, the muscles that stabilize the pelvis, the deep abdominal muscles, the transverse abdominis, and there are 3 other layers of abdominal muscles. Those are intimately related to how the psoas is functioning. And then the muscles on the back of the pelvis and there's some other hip flexor muscles involved as well. So it's just in the middle of a whole bunch of things going on in the pelvis. And one of the things that we want to particularly pay attention to is the diaphragm. This is the big muscle that we use for breathing. So partly because you can see mechanically how they're both related to the attachments in the spine, but partly just because of the responsiveness of the nervous system to the diaphragm, and the responsiveness of the diaphragm to the nervous system, and the responsiveness of the psoas to the nervous system and the diaphragm. There's a relationship between the two. And what this means, bottom line, is whenever there's a stress in our system, in the nervous system, our breathing patterns are disrupted, they're changed, and that has an effect on the indirectly on the psoas. In addition to directly, the psoas is very sensitive to stress because of the direct input from the nervous system, and then because of its relationship with the psoas. So, because many of us have a chronic low level of stress in lives, it's so common that and so familiar to us, we might not even recognize the fact that we're walking around with a low level of anxiety or a low level of stress of some kind in the body. And what that means is that the psoas is often chronically trying to contract. It's chronically tense or chronically shortened. The other input to the psoas, which can cause it to also be shortened or tense, is our lifestyle. So if you sit a lot, then the psoas is obviously constantly in, or at least during that time, in its contracted position. And of course, because it doesn't get elongated, or seldom does, it's shortened. So those two things in modern lifestyles are huge in terms of imbalances and problems in the psoas. The too much sitting and the kind of exercise that emphasizes hip flexion and not elongating. And then secondly, the stress unmanaged stress and bad breathing patterns that go along with that. Given that, right away you can see two things that you might want to work with are regular relaxation practices and the kind of yogic practices that help to keep the nervous system in balance. And we'll get a little bit more on those. In the meantime, we might want to think about the causes of stress. So fear, whether it's fear of losing something we have or not getting what we want, sometimes it's physical fear, but often in our society it's psychological, or we find our image of ourselves threatened. So that kind of fear, also desire and anger, and those things are all related. So it may be that we can see that our emotional life is the impetus in the nervous system that creates the tension in the psoas. So from this we can see that the psoas is very tender and responsive to all of our emotional experiences. And that being the origin of a lot of its tension or its tendency to contract or shorten, means that part of what we want to do in order to have a healthy and balanced psoas is to begin to work with those things in our life. One last point is remembering that the psoas is paired. So if one side is shorter than the other, you can imagine the chaos that's going to occur in the pelvis and in all of the other muscles that are involved in movement and stabilizing the spine and the legs and the pelvis, from the QL to the trapezius to the diaphragm to the all of the other hip flexors and the hip rotators. It's just when you've destabilized the foundation by creating one side shorter than the other, it's hard for anything else to be in the right position. So very important that things be balanced from right.